Okay, great. I think we have Andy now. You're on mute, Michaela. Right. I'm going to share my screen, and I think we have a few participants, and we're live on YouTube. So yeah, we can get going. Welcome to the Project Access Academy scholarships and financial aid webinar. This is a very quick introduction to all things financial aid and and yeah, let me just get this correct. Cool. So as I said, welcome. This is a very high level overview of a deep and confusing and infinitely complex topic. And the way we're going to go about this is quick introduction. We're going to look at the basics of financial aid in the US for international students, because it's a very different picture to financial aid for domestic students. We're going to look at the basis of applying for that financial aid once you've got in and through the application process. Then we're going to make sure that you understand the difference between scholarships, like sports scholarships, academic scholarships, versus like financial aid, because frankly, most of the schools that Project Access supports you apply to don't offer themselves many scholarships. They but mostly offer financial aid. And then we're going to speak about our experiences before touching on some resources, and then having a Q&A. So the presentation should take hopefully around half an hour, and then we can spend about 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever, on a bit of a Q&A, and yeah, take it from there. As I said, super high level, like we'll try and answer whatever questions we can, but I'll preface this with just saying that it's the universities make this a complex topic because they have incentive to do so. And like what I would advise even from the start is, looking to join our sort of mentorship program, where we can have specialist mentors who are trained in helping you get the most frankly money out of the universities and out of your sort of local governments and national governments, and spend a lot more time helping you personally. But quickly, we'll just introduce Project Access, what we do for those of you who don't know. Our mission is to increase access to top education for anyone in the world who has the potential to reach it. So we help underprivileged students, as I said, from anywhere in the world. We're in over 30 countries right now, by pairing them with a mentor at the university of their dreams, hopefully from the country they're from, who can guide them through the application process in our structured programs, and achieve their dreams. So we've helped over 3,000 students in the past 4 years. We're live in the UK, in pretty much all the top schools in the UK, and in the US, which is obviously more important for this webinar. We have teams at Harvard, Stanford, MIT, Columbia, Yale, you name it. So we're here to help you. This is really the first step in that process, we hope. And yeah, just shoot any questions in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end. I think that covers very broadly what Project Access does. Quick introduction. My name's Harrison Smith. I study computer science and history, or at least I try to, at Yale. I'm going into my 3rd year there, but obviously I'm from the UK originally, so I can touch a little bit on that. Joining us a little later, I think he has some sort of meeting right now, is Oliver Asaibi, who's also from the UK, studying economics at the Wharton School, which is obviously a famous part of Penn University on the East Coast. And then I will hand over to Michaela and Andy to introduce themselves properly.
All right, my name is Michaela. I was originally from, or I still am, from Bolivia, La Paz, Bolivia. I was born there, moved to the US about 10 years now. So I did apply to school in the US as a domestic student, but I'm currently an incoming third year at Stanford University, studying international relations and human rights.
Hi, everyone. My name is Andy. I feel like I'm very similar to Michaela, but I was born in Argentina. I spent some time moving around my whole life. So I've lived in various US states. I also spent some time in South Korea. When I was in high school, I also was in a US high school. So I did apply as a domestic student. Um, Now I'm at Stanford studying international relations, and I hope we can help collectively provide some insight in how the financial aid process works in the US for international students.
Awesome. And just quick point, I should have put this on this slide. I am obviously on the Yale campus team. I'm a mentor at Yale, and Andy and Michaela are on our newly formed Stanford campus team as well. We're not just random people on a webinar. So I'll quickly hand over to Andy to talk about the basics of financial aid, or Andy and Michaela, and I will just click.
Great. So financial aid is a bit tricky for applying to US universities. The issue is that for US colleges, there are two types mainly. There are public universities and there are private universities. So public universities obviously are funded by the US government, but for those universities, it means that there is very, very limited, sometimes practically non-existent funding available for those schools to give to international students. So that's very unfortunate. However, private universities have a little bit more leeway because they can do as they like with their funds. But oftentimes you find that even so, they don't offer as robust a financial aid package to international students as they can for domestic students. And this is for a number of reasons. Sometimes it's because they do receive a little bit of money from the US government, but that can only be used for domestic students. In other cases, they receive, large endowments and donations from their former alumni and other investors. But those funds are restricted again to domestic students. So again, the funds that are available for international students are unfortunately very limited. However, we're going to talk a little bit in this webinar about schools that, despite all this, are able to meet the full financial demonstrated need for international students. So what I just said, demonstrated financial need. What that means essentially is based on your family's socioeconomic status and also perhaps partially on where you are located. The school will conduct its own internal assessment of how much financial aid your family would need in order to support sending you to that university. And they will sometimes take this into account in terms of not just whether to offer you financial aid, but actually, unfortunately, in some cases, whether they can offer you admission into the university at all. So we're going to talk a little bit about the words need blind and need aware and what those words mean in relation to your demonstrated financial need. So in the US, there are 5 universities that are fully need blind, quote unquote need blind, and meet full aid for your full need for international students. So these schools are Harvard, Yale, Princeton, MIT, and Amherst College. So what need blind means is that regardless of whether you need financial aid or not, that will have absolutely no impact or bearing on whether they admit you into the school or not. So they do not care whether you're requesting financial aid. You have just as likely a chance of getting accepted as any other student. However, apart from these 5 schools, unfortunately, a lot of universities are need aware. What this means is that if you mark down that you're an international student who is applying for financial aid, this may come into consideration when weighing you against another student. So unfortunately, this means that it is a disadvantage It means that if there's someone who has the same exact profile and stats as you, but that person did not request financial aid, they may, sometimes they don't, but they may favor that student over you when considering admission. That being said, even these need-aware schools, if you do happen to get accepted by them, despite the lower chances, a lot of them will still meet the full financial need that you demonstrate for the students that they accept. So these are schools like Columbia, University of Pennsylvania or Wharton, Brown and Dartmouth, and many, many other schools. What this means is that, yes, if you're applying for financial aid, you have a lesser chance of getting in, but if you do get in, you won't need to worry about not being able to afford it because they will provide enough financial aid to cover whatever you need. That being said, this is something that you will need to take proactive steps to research for every university you're applying to, and really be clear on whether they are need blind or if they're need aware, and most importantly, if they meet full need for international accepted students. So the last point I want to hit on before I pass it on to Michaela is the idea of student contributions. So this is a little bit strange because what it basically means is that even for students that receive the fullest financial aid packages possible, they will still actually be forced, or not, I shouldn't say forced, but they'll be expected to pay around $5,000 usually per the year. So basically, like you can expect to pay 5,000 US dollars per year. And it's complicated why they do this, but we'll cover different ways that you can cover this cost. It won't all need to come up from like directly out of pocket. There will usually be work study programs at universities. So especially if you're international students, you might expect you can try and get an on-campus job to help cover your costs. You can also find, again, outside scholarships that will cover some of this $5,000. And later, Ollie will talk a little bit about what opportunities are available there. So that's it for the basic overview. And I'll now pass it on to Michaela with the application process for financial aid.
Sweet.
Awesome. Thank you, Andy. As he said, there may be certain requirements that vary upon school. So the number one thing is really to take a good look about what schools you're applying to and exactly what they need from you in order to consider you for financial aid. But some of the big things that are required by most schools are what's known as the CSS profile and the IDoc. And so we're just going to go over the general overview on what they are so that you have an understanding when you take a look at them. So both of these are, I guess, provided by the College Board in case you're looking it up. And the CSS profile, unfortunately, you will need to pay to be able to use this, even though it's a required material for financial aid. It's usually $25 for the first school. In essence, what it is, these are platforms where you will be entering in some way your financial information, your family's financial information. That being said, a good thing to keep in mind when thinking of applying to school with financial aid is to keep track of your family's financial data for that year and usually also the years prior, because what these two required materials essentially do is compile it in a way that it fits university organization, and in that way they can try to assess how much need you need so they can try to meet it. And so both of these will be essentially be places where you will be inputting financial information from you and your family. So going back to the CSS profile though, what these platforms will do is send out the information to the respective colleges you're applying to. And for the CSS profile, it does have a cost, which is important to note. It is $25 to send your information to the first school and $16 to send it to every additional school afterward. There are certain school-specific fee waivers, which we found is true for Yale. but unfortunately, this may not be true for every school you're applying to. But definitely look for those resources if those apply. And again, we will be covering various ways that you may be able to cover that despite the school, or in this case, the college board not being able to provide you the waiver if you're an international student. Concerning the file dates, we'll come back to, and yeah, they're very connected since they're both provided by College Board, which is a big website or platform. And so you should be able to find them easily, but those are the full names in case you are trying to look them up. After that though, I think the main thing is to do your research, look at university websites and anything, but it's also good to note that you can always reach out to these to university financial aid offices, or universities also tend to have international centers, which are centers made to provide support for international students. So these people are there to help you. They want to make sure that incoming students or potentially incoming students know how to go about these complicated processes. So if also, as Harrison said, you can access these, but it may be a bit complicated. In that case, I would suggest reach out to the people that can help you. But right now, especially right now, they may be available to talk to you through Zoom, which would help, so you don't have to do international calls, and you can see them and they can see you. They may also be able to talk through other platforms. So definitely do that. They're there to help you, and they can explain a lot more information. And we can go to the next slide, Harrison, if possible. So this is like the big general timeline. This is actually the timeline for Harvard financial aid applications. As you can see, for early action, they may want you to submit your financial aid documents earlier. For regular decision, it's around early February, so about a month after you submit your regular decision applications. We kept the two required materials for international students are the CSS profile, which is the first one, and the IDoc, which is the third one. And you can see a middle one called FAFSA that's crossed out. And we just thought it would be important to note, you may be seeing this read about this document called FAFSA in various places, but just know this is one of those documents that is meant for domestic students only. And so if you're an international student, you don't have to submit that, and you actually can't submit that. But this is a big general timeline to keep a lookout for. Again, though, it may vary upon school, so definitely look at the specifics for the schools you're applying to.
Yeah. Awesome. So a quick tour of the differences between scholarships versus financial aid, especially at the schools we're thinking about, and the schools that we've been talking about just over the past 10 minutes or so. Financial aid basically doesn't discriminate by how talented you are in any particular area, whereas scholarships don't discriminate by how much you can afford to pay, only how talented you are in a particular area, if that makes sense. So the important thing to remember on this slide is the first line. Most of the universities that you guys are hopefully applying to, or we can help you apply to with Project Access, don't really offer the sort of scholarships you typically think about when you think scholarships. So when you think about scholarships, people think about a basketball scholarship to, Duke or something, or an academic scholarship to wherever, right? And you get money because because Duke really wants you to go there over North Carolina. And the schools we're thinking about, so Harvard, Yale, Stanford, don't offer, correct me if I'm massively wrong here, but don't offer those sort of scholarships, because frankly, everyone who gets in would get a scholarship at other universities. And the way they see it is that, and that's what they want. They want that sort of talented community, and they want to be able to just offer financial aid. The other thing I would say, just in addition to the great points that Andy and Michaela have made, is like, especially for, again, the schools we're thinking about, remember that their endowments, well, they might change with the pandemic, but their endowments are pretty huge. You're thinking like 20-30 billion dollars. And when they accept you into their university, that's them saying that we want you sort of no matter what, and we're going to help you pay what we think you can afford. The other thing I was just going to say on the financial aid side is that it's reviewed like every year around how much you can afford to pay, and you can object to what they think you can afford. And there's a very like basic heuristic. Think about like how much, for instance, the university costs, which you can find pretty easily, and then if you then add on, I don't know, something like 25-30% to that cost. So Yale, for instance, if Yale costs $70,000 a year to go to it all in, if your family is earning less than, say, $100,000 a year, you're looking at a significant amount of financial aid there. Jumping back to scholarships, you can still get scholarships, especially as an international student. You can get scholarships from your regional or like your home government. I have friends from Hong Kong who have done this from all over the place. Like I think that's, as I said at the start, this is more of a high level presentation. Like your mentor from that university, who has also probably gone through the process of getting those scholarships, will be able to help you a lot more on those specific details. But do your research again, and start now. This is the time to do it, because a lot of people will be going for those scholarships, and there may be all sorts of conditions on them. I'm not sure. So I hope that sort of clarifies that. This also isn't to what's the word, like suggest you shouldn't look at the other universities like Duke or like USC who do offer scholarships, because they can also be fantastic universities. And if you can go to them for free because you're amazing at basketball or whatever it is, I apologize, look at that, because it could be awesome. I think from my perspective, the last thing I will say is there's this bad conception, I think, that the US is super expensive for international students, or it's just expensive in general, which it is, but it doesn't have to be, especially if you can navigate the sort of situations and the process which we're going through now. Like, it's important to recognize that if you can't afford to go there on the like how much it costs, there's a very high probability that if you have the potential to get into these schools, you might end up paying very little, often even less than in the UK, for instance. So that's just a personal thing that I have found talking to other people that sometimes can be cleared up. Anything else on this from you, Ollie, or from anyone else? No. All right, awesome. So we'll just quickly touch on our experiences. I believe that is Penn, is it, Ollie?
Yeah, Penn.
Yeah, that's Penn. Looks quite nice, actually. So I'll throw it back to Andy. And how was it for you, Andy?
Yeah, how was it for me? That's a very good question, Harrison. So I am a rising third year. So wow, I applied the fall of 2017. I can still remember that it was probably like the most stressful time of my life. I had this sinking feeling that I would not get into like any of the universities that I was applying for. And I would like, it kind of like ruined the opportunities that like my family had worked so hard to provide me, et cetera, the difficult emotions that come with that. So I'm going into college with this mindset. As you know, I honestly imagine some of you are feeling a similar pressure or like having similar worries. So what it was like for me was I applied through a program called QuestBridge. That is, I believe it is a US, unfortunately, US only program. But I think there are, the space for educational access is always growing. And I wouldn't be surprised, honestly, if a similar program like this were to be released for international students within the coming years. But what QuestBridge is essentially allows you to apply for many schools early action. So whereas, a lot of, you might know that a lot of early action schools are single choice or restrictive early action. I applied to 5 early schools, and those were Yale, Stanford, Princeton, Columbia, and UPenn. And wouldn't you know, I got deferred from all 5. So in December, it was like receiving 5 rejections, like a slap in the face. And I was like, man, okay. I went on to apply to several more schools. It was not very good for morale. I would honestly say I applied to too many schools in the end. I think ended up applying for upwards to like 17 schools. I did have a fee waiver at the time. So it wasn't like I was paying for all that, but I do think just in terms of general applications, you don't apply for more than like 15 schools. You would get significantly diminishing returns in the amount of time you spend per application after that. That being said, I was fortunate to have a pretty happy ending. I got accepted to Stanford, UC Berkeley, UCLA, and quite a few other schools. And I received many very competitive financial aid offers and scholarships that are allowing me to afford an education that is otherwise completely out of my reach. So I'm hoping that you guys, stressed as you may be, will find like similar successes in the next coming few years. My advice would be to start your research process basically now. The earlier, the sooner, the better. Because you never know what tidbit of information you will find that really dramatically shifts your college planning strategy, whether it's, which school you end up applying to early decision or early action, or how you go about writing your essays, all these things. It's a very cumulative process, and in my experience, as much information as you try to consume, you would find more and more, bits to like kind of play around with and like pick at in terms of like doing your research. So start now and complete your application well ahead of time. I'm going to share something I probably shouldn't, but I submitted my Stanford application pretty much like the last second, literally the last second possible. There were like 10 seconds to go before it clicked from like 11:59 p.m. to 12 a.m. What I didn't know at the time is that—
You got in, so,
Yeah, well, listen. So what I didn't know at the time was that for Stanford, they close, like their thing stops accepting applications after 11:59. And everything that comes in after that is just pretty much straight rejected. They don't even look at it. So I was really cutting it close there. And not only that, I actually ended up making a few mistakes because I was like, quickly through like the check boxes at the end. And I actually accidentally clicked the checkbox, I found out later, for I am an international student applying for no financial aid. I had clicked that box and then sent in my application. So obviously they figured out it was a mistake and I was fine. But don't be me. Don't submit last minute. That'd be my advice to you. I'm going to pass it on to Michaela on that note.
Yeah, I think that was an interesting point. Just before we switch over, that I think we forgot to mention on the sort of like high level overview as well, that if you are lucky enough to get into multiple schools who will offer financial aid, you can barter, perhaps is the word, or at least try to play both of the schools off against each other, because they all want you, and they potentially will offer you more money to encourage you to go to that school over another school. Important point to remember. But to Michaela.
What a story, Andy. What a story. I guess for me, so as I mentioned, I was born in Bolivia. I felt a huge pressure when applying to these schools. So if you are having a hard time, if it's stressful for you, you're not alone. It's very stressful. But we just have to get through it and just do our best, right? Just do your best. That would be my biggest advice. My application story, I also agree with Andy. I think you want, since these schools, the interesting part is that, they try to accept on a basis of, who they think can thrive in their college and various other factors like that. But it's important to note that they're not perfect, right? There are many applicants that could have gotten in that just were not accepted due to like sometimes small arbitrary reasons, right? There's so many applicants that could thrive in these colleges and they have such limited spots that it's like also from their end, it's hard to figure out who to accept, right? There are just too many great applicants. So definitely apply to a lot. I think something that surprised me was one time a counselor I reached out to told me that I should be thinking about applying to more than around 12 to 15 schools, I think. And that surprised me at first. So I think that's a good point that Andy brought. In case you don't know, like it may be a good ballpark if you have the means, right? That being said, these applications can be very hard. I also received a fee waiver, and that's why I was able to apply to a few, but yeah, just keep that in mind. My application story was I ended up applying early action to one school, not through Questbridge, so I could only apply to one, and I applied to Harvard, and thank the Lord I was accepted. After that, I diminished by a lot. That's why I don't have around 15 either. I diminished my these schools I would be applying to after that. So I ended up applying to a few more, Stanford, Princeton, MIT, and Brown. And I had submitted 4 applications to 4 UCs before I got the news on Harvard. And among those were UCLA and UC Berkeley. And also thank the Lord, I was accepted by all, including an early notification by Stanford. And that was just the craziest thing for me. My application story would just be consistent of so much work into those applications. I really tried to finish all of them at least a week early before any deadline. That being said, some things just happen. I wanted to submit an arts portfolio for Stanford and found out the week before it was due that it was due that week. I think it was around November or late October or something like that. So that being said, in the situation that you find yourself, some deadlines coming up a lot faster than you thought, it can be done, right? Just put the hours in. Things will happen, right? I guess that's what I wanted to say. Things will happen, and again, just try your best. But yes, do your research early. Again, that is very important. If you could avoid being put into those situations, that would be best. And I did apply to some scholarships, and right now I'm on full scholarship through financial aid and through the Gates scholarship, which I think is maybe only for domestic students, unfortunately. My biggest advice would be, aside from starting early, is to really reach out to the resources that you have or that you could have. That being said, Project Access is an organization that is offering their help. Reach out. These things are hard, so any help you can get, it can make a huge difference. But if you're not exactly in a place where you're offered many resources, just take them. I think just look things up. There are things that you don't even know existed. At least that was the case for me. If someone offers you help to read over your essays, be on top of things, try to write your essays early, try to send it to them so they can read it. I just heard a lot of stories where people got offered help, but they didn't really take advantage of it because they were unsure or something like that. I think when it comes to college, like any help counts. So a big thing for me though, I would say college, the essays, at least for US private schools or US schools in general, you'll be asked to write quite a few essays during the applications. They are really important. Don't dismiss them. They can help you stand out by a lot. That's where I spent a lot of time in. And yeah, it can help a lot.
Awesome. By contrast, I wrote all of my essays on the last night and got rejected from everywhere. So that's my quick 10-second story. And we will talk about Ollie's story instead.
Yeah, hi guys, I joined late. So I'm Oliver and I'm a rising junior at Penn, as we said earlier. So I guess I guess my journey was like a little different since I grew up in London, so I had no ties to America. So like I didn't have any kind of access to any of these programs like Gates or Questbridge. So I guess my application story, well, I mean, my US story first started in like 2016 when I like randomly applied to and got a scholarship to a summer school at Yale. I think it was called like Yale Young Global Scholars. So that was like my first taste of like the US, and I was like, this is like a much more interesting system than in the UK. So that's kind of like where the seeds of like, okay, I want to go to the US started. And then I did that the summer before my final year of high school. Oh, cool. Cool, Andy. Maybe we're in the same year. But yeah, and so I came into my final year of college. I was like, of
high school.
America, but high school. There we go. Of high school, and I was like, okay, this was cool. I want to apply to America, but my high school was like a normal state school. People didn't really go to like good schools in the UK, so no one had really gone abroad. So it wasn't necessarily something that was like received, I guess like seriously, by like my teachers. But I think over the course of like my first semester of like my final semester of high school, I became serious about it. But I also wasn't happy with like my SAT scores and all of those things. So then I think around November, I had applied to like a gap year program where basically I could work for a consulting firm in my gap year. And then I decided I wanted to do that and take the year to kind of strengthen my application for America and apply in my gap year. So essentially in my final year of high school, I didn't apply to any colleges. I just like focused on my A-levels and did my exams. So then during my gap year is when I was working and also applied. I applied early action to Yale because that was the only place I'd been to, and I was like, wow, this is amazing. So then I applied to Yale early action. I think at that point I didn't fully understand how different it was from the UK, in that just because you have good grades like doesn't mean like you'll get in. So I think I was a bit too relaxed. So I mean, like I obviously put effort into the Yale application, but then I applied and I kind of just like let it sit. And I did my my interview in London. And then December came around and I got deferred, and I was like, okay. So now I need to like apply to a bunch of other schools. But I think most people, and this is like bad practice, what you should do is apply early and then continue to like build out your regular decision applications. So don't be like me and be complacent. So when I got that email December 15th, I was like, okay, now I need to apply to a bunch of other places. So yeah, that must have been like one of the most awful like Christmas breaks of my life, honestly. I think I churned out about like 13 different applications, and it was just a grind. And one of the applications was Stanford. And if you guys have seen the Stanford application, that's like 10 applications in one, so many essays. So I did all of that throughout like December. Like Andy, I think I submitted I actually submitted my application to Penn. Literally, I missed the deadline, but then Penn had extended the deadline, so like the 5th of January, so that I like applied. And so that's how that happened. But when I was kind of going through those colleges, I was mostly just trying to focus on the schools that I knew were, I guess, big enough that they would probably give out aid. So I didn't really apply. I think I applied to like 2 or 3 like small colleges, but unless like I found one that was like a really good, sort of good fit for me, I didn't really apply. And with Penn, so as you'll see in the comment app, when you apply to colleges, you have to pick your major. At some colleges like Penn, you need to pick your major, but your major is also tied to like which school you're in. So like at Penn, there's engineering, there's Wharton, the business school, there's the college, and there's nursing. So at this time, I just wanted to do econ, and I think I only applied to to the business school because I read an article, and like somewhere, I think it was like Cura, and someone said econ is more applied in Wharton. So I applied to that, like not knowing anything about Wharton, not knowing like what Wharton was. Obviously, like when I got in, I came to like know what Wharton was. I was like, huh, that was a lucky, I guess, random choice. But that's kind of how my application went. And then so after January, I had more interviews. I also applied to a place called NYU AD, which is NYU Abu Dhabi campus, which is fairly new, but it's a really cool campus. That's, I think it's like 70% internationals, 20% people from the UAE, and like 10% Americans. It was a really, really cool campus. And when you apply to that university and they like you, you get shortlisted. And so they flew me out to the campus for a 4-day candidate weekend, which was like in February. And that was like a really cool experience. I think it was great because as someone who couldn't afford to just like go visit colleges, I hadn't seen any of the colleges I'd applied to, which was like a bigger deal than I kind of like thought at first. Because when I went to NYU AD and like I met students and I got to see the beautiful campus, I was like, wow, this place is really amazing. And like, while like at first I'd only applied because I thought it was different. I read that they gave out a lot of aids to internationals, and because I knew that there would be like a really cool trip. Like when I actually went, I was like, wait, this is actually like a really cool campus and like a really cool university that I'd actually want to go to. So after that trip, that actually ended up being like my top choice. But anyway, so then in March, obviously, in March we hear back, and then I ended up being accepted to UPenn and NYU AD with full funding. And I think something that actually to bear in mind there is that I had applied to like a lot of smaller colleges and like a lot of colleges that maybe had higher acceptance rates that I just didn't get accepted in, that I didn't get accepted to. And so I think during March, a lot of those colleges come out earlier than the Ivies, for example. So I remember during that month feeling very like demotivated because I'm like, oh wow, like if I'm not getting into like this small college that has like a 40% acceptance rate, then like I've got no chance with the Ivies that I applied to and all of that. So it can definitely be like a very disheartening experience. And like I think that just really taught me to like understand how like different the US system is. And it really, like if you get rejected from somewhere, especially if it's a smaller school, it literally could be because they just don't have the funds to like support your demonstrated need. And I think that's like an important thing to bear in mind, both when you're applying and also when you're hearing back, because sometimes it really can just be like a numbers game, especially at smaller schools. So that's something to kind of bear in mind when you're like putting together your list of colleges to apply to. So then when I got into those 2 colleges, honestly at the time, which people called me very crazy for, I was like very conflicted, which I guess people found weird because, wow, you've got into like an Ivy and like Wharton versus like NYU or Abu Dhabi, which no one has heard of. But in my head, it was a university in Pennsylvania that I'd never seen and I didn't really know anything about, versus a college that I'd been to. I'd met people, I knew that like it was my vibe, it was like super international. And so in the end, obviously, upon doing more research and upon like realizing that, okay, I applied to America because I wanted the American experience. So even though like I know nothing about this Penn place, I should just like trust the process and hope that like that's like the better opportunity, even though like I loved NYU AD. So that's kind of how I thought about that decision. So then my tip from kind of that whole experience is definitely apply, I guess do research. And because I know for like a lot of people, it's just not feasible to go on these like US tours and like see Stanford and see Penn and see Harvard. It's really expensive. So I'd really try to take advantage of colleges that like allow you to fly out. I know that's very common for when you're applying to like scholarships at public schools. They have like a lot of fly out programs when you're in the final stages. So I know like UVA does it, UNC does it, I think, and like a lot of other ones. And then also with schools that are like linked to the US, like Yale and US, which is in Singapore, NYU Abu Dhabi, and Minerva KGI doesn't do it, but it's just like another cool program if you guys have heard about it. So I'd say that's like a key thing to bear in mind. I'm just checking if there's anything else I didn't cover. Yeah, and then also which I touched on earlier, just like when you're making your list of places to apply to, definitely do try to take into account like the endowment size of that university, and because that's a pretty good proxy for how much aid they would give out, especially how much aid they'd give out to international students. Because that pool is definitely, like when you apply for aid as international, you'll sometimes put into like a different pool if the university is need aware. So it's definitely important to not only factor like in where you could see yourself, but also like if you look at your list and you're seeing like a lot of smaller colleges where perhaps the pool of aids isn't as high, but you're really like, but you really want to go to the US, maybe try to factor that in and apply to some bigger schools that have a higher endowment and that would have like a bigger, that would take a lot more internationals who are on aid. So that's kind of like my whirlwind story, and that's my advice.
That's awesome. Yeah. As I sort of also touched on, I don't have a slide, but I'm not sure why. But like I think the experience of an international student, the Project Access is essentially trying to make the experience of the international student as complete as the experience that you heard from Michaela and Andy was being in the US, because there are just so limited resources relatively in like international schools to what these guys had at their schools in the US. And that's for financial aid. That's also for the application side of things. So this touches on this slide as well in terms of resources. I'll actually start at the bottom. The number one resource, at least that we're plugging here, is Project Access, is our mentors, is our program, our resources, and guiding you through that process. Like I went through a very similar experience to Ollie around like applying to school early. I actually applied early. Like I did almost the same thing as Ollie in terms of applying. I actually applied while I was in my senior year of sort of like high school, and basically just got like rejected from everywhere. But I applied to Harvard early and thought, oh, I'm sort of done now. And then I got like deferred from Harvard, and I was like, oh shit. And I spent like the Christmas writing applications. And one thing I really sort of like empathize with from Ollie's perspective is like, because I didn't have that sort of guide there, I don't think I appreciated the importance of the essays and the extent of the competition when you're applying. And I was sort of like took the approach of like, oh, I'll probably get in somewhere and I'll be fine. But like, that's just not going to cut it. And like, we're really here to help you in terms of financial aid and scholarships. The first thing, as Michaela said, and especially right now, contact the financial aid officers. It's what they're paid for. It's what they do. They are like more than willing to help. They're not just trying to like save money. It's not their money. Contact them now and just talk to them. Have a conversation. Ask questions like the questions you can hopefully ask us, and we can try and answer. Ask them. They are literally experts in this for the university, and talk to a range of different schools and get different opinions. you know, also look directly on their websites. You know, get, as Ollie said as well, get an idea of their endowment. Do your research. The next thing is on the regional and like national government scholarships. That obviously differs across regions, across where you are. Again, do your research. Join Project Access. Will pair you with a mentor who had probably gone through that process before and can help you. There is money to be found there. It's just a case of looking in the right places. I think that really like covers it all. And I hope that was helpful as well. I think it's good that we sort of touched on the application process in general. And the other thing that was coming to mind was around when Ollie was speaking. You know, even if you could fly on a private plane all around the US to visit the colleges, you couldn't right now. And a lot of the colleges are adapting quite nicely, actually, for people who can't afford to take the private plane all around. And they're doing virtual tours and all that sort of thing. So look on the website and you can tour and get a good idea about like what it looks like from there. And you'd also get a good idea from your mentor, right? Like my actual experiences, initially I visited Yale and they showed me a video. Andy will hate this because Andy's actually in an a cappella group, but they showed me a video of like a whole a cappella group singing, and I'm from the UK and we don't do a cappella in the UK. And I didn't even apply to Yale the first year. It put me off so much. And now I go to Yale and it's great. And a cappella is also great, by the way. But like, I think talking to people directly, and especially people like who've been in the similar situation, is really the best approach. So that, you know, really concludes the presentation. Here's all our contact details with you know, what we do in Project Access. You know, email us as necessary, but also please post messages in the chat now. There's one here that I can take because it's actually something that I sort of gone through around having real estate or just any other sort of assets, but then like your parent also might be being unemployed or having the sort of low income, or that's not low income, but relatively low income. So I think the short story is in very direct answer to your question about will they expect my family to sell real estate to pay for my tuition? I think honestly it depends. Like they really might. I think the important part of the answer here is that you will have to tell them that you have those assets, and that will come into their consideration. And the next thing is that they might say to you, this is how much financial aid we think you can afford to pay based on the fact that you have these assets as well as your income. And you can object to that and say, hey, well, like these are on a loan or whatever. But I think this is sort of like a general point from what Michaela was saying. Like the portal is quite good for like on the Common App for like actually submitting it. The amount of information you have to submit is like pretty insane, and it's very, very complete, and you know, like you really like you it's a dangerous game if you to leave anything out. Like you should not be leaving anything out of that in terms of your sort of like family assets and statements and whatever. And it's that's a big task, and they're going to take everything into account.
Yeah.
Anything else on there?
I'd echo that. I'd say definitely when you're going through the application, like it takes a lot of time, so definitely like don't just do it last minute. And I'd also say that make sure that I think there's like a misconception that some people think that if they do their aid application in a way where it looks like they need less money, then that increases their chances of getting in. I'd say that like I have friends at Penn who like or like I've got friends who apply to Penn and try to do that, and it can be really tricky because once you get in, they've allocated a specific amount of the pool to you, and so if you suddenly like say if they give you a package that you're not able to afford, that just in the end ends up going against you. So I definitely say, like, when you're going through the CSS profile, it's definitely, I think at first I found it to be like a very, for lack of better words, like invasive process, in that like they really do ask you everything. But I'd say just try to be as honest as possible with that, because in the end, if you get a package that you can't afford, it can be a bit tricky to sort of like go back on what you put in your original application.
Awesome. On sports scholarships and academic scholarships, I can take this live as well. So I think again the short answer is yes. Like, schools that offer the sports scholarships will also be offering. I'm not entirely sure specifically on UCLA. I think Michaela and Andy, who applied there, can probably answer this better. But like, yes, like they will also, many of the schools who do sports scholarships will also offer academic scholarships based on, I know, a variety of factors like your standardized test scores and stuff like that. But I think Andy is waiting to answer better. Yeah.
So unfortunately, UCLA is a public California state school, and they offer neither financial aid nor scholarship offerings for international students, not sports scholarships to my knowledge. That being said, there are a number of state schools that do offer, and just US schools in general, that do offer merit-based scholarships to US universities. I know Michigan State University offers scholarships and grants to students. Wesleyan University offers the same. Iowa State University offers the same. And there must be others, but
there's tons of others like that offer it. Like,
yeah,
tons of smaller schools and everything. Yeah.
I'm not as well versed about sports scholarships, but I can look into that right now and I'll get back to you.
On sports scholarships, like, again, I'm not sure specifically on UCLA, but there like tons of universities in the US. This is not something we help with particularly on Project Access side, but tons of universities on the US side offer sports scholarships for international students. It's a huge thing. Okay. Will universities decrease financial aid for international students due to COVID-19? I'm from one of the countries worst hit by the pandemic, and now my parents are hesitant about sending me to the US. I think it's difficult to answer this like generally, like take the general sort of like approach for all universities in the US. I think that if I was to try and answer it generally, I would say that there likely will be a hit to all financial aid packages potentially from the universities, because of like that they've lost money on the endowment on due to COVID, or they'll have less people enrolling and paying full tuition due to it. That being said, like, I would say two things around like whether that would impact your decision. I think that they will still offer like full scholarships. It's not like they're never going to offer any full scholarships. They'll still be offering full scholarships if you literally can't afford to pay, and they'll still be offering like large amounts of financial aid anyway. You know, Yale, Harvard, and Stanford have enormous endowments, and they're all fundamentally competing for the best people, as you saw, like for instance with Michaela. Michaela is obviously amazing enough to get into lots of these schools, and they all wonder and the financial aid plays off. So I would really encourage you, and we're going to write a blog post about this, I think later this week or next week, about why you should sort of still look to apply to the US, you know, in spite of COVID and in spite of everything, especially compared to say the UK, quite frankly. So like, I'm obviously not sure where you're from, but if you're from anywhere in Europe, right, like the price have gone up massively in the UK, probably more than they will go up in America. I don't know if that answers it completely. As I said, it's difficult. Jump in.
So obviously, this is an unprecedented sort of economic global situation. And I think it is important that, just to be upfront, you should have contingencies in place. There are cases where people have just gone full send and gone from like planning to apply to the domestic college, just fully sending to like US universities and being successful. That being said, it's very, very difficult, very rare. And I would hate for, you to find your life plans have been jeopardized because of this new situation. However, I will point back to, again, the 5 schools that are 100% committed to being need blind and fully meeting full demonstrated need. And those are Harvard, Princeton, Yale, MIT, and Amherst. So those schools, again, they will not take financial aid into consideration at all when you apply. You'll have just the same chance as any student, whether it's domestic or international. It's a completely even playing field. And I would say that of those, I think Yale especially has like a significant international student body compared to the other campuses. And I would also say that other than those 5, there are other need blind admissions-based US colleges. So be sure to, especially considering your situation, be on the lookout and research those colleges where your admission won't be impacted by your financial state.
And I just echo what Andy said about making sure like not like to also apply to your domestic colleges. Like in my gap year when I applied to the US, I also did go through UCAS and apply to UK universities. So I think it's definitely important to have those backup plans in place, especially going into the next year when things are, as Andy said, a bit less certain.
Great. Yeah. All right, there's a couple of questions here. This is a good question. How are all of you coping with the new Trump or the Trump administration on international students? It definitely keeps me up at night. I would say that it is certainly quite stressful. Not knowing what's going to happen sort of tomorrow, and not being able to predict it at all, really. I think like one thing that does give me peace of mind, and again, like I think I'm going to write like a blog or something about this, is like a couple of things. So it's important to remember that like Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Penn have far more people sort of like in far more like alumni sort of in positions of power all around the country, that they have quite a lot of influence, and they also like are quite vested in their international student population, like unfortunately or unfortunately, like quite a lot of the international population pays almost for the full amount. So it's very important to these universities that those students can come. Just with regard to the sort of like announcement last week. And my experience with Yale and stuff has been basically them all the universities working together to try and resolve it and sort of prevent the Trump administration having that sort of impact, and also like working for like contingency plans and workarounds so that they can continue to provide the education. So like the last thing as well, like my experience, like people ask me this is around like what's it like being in America or whatever with Trump and stuff, and I always say that I can really tell them, because when you're at like a school like Yale or Stanford or whatever, it's you're in such a bubble that's like created to help you just sort of just purely learn and focus, and it's a very, very frankly quite privileged like environment that you don't experience the sort of so many of the downsides that are obviously coming from the Trump administration. So like again, I'd still encourage people to apply to the US. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Ollie. I covered it. We don't like to talk about it. Right, cool. How big is the expected family contribution? Percentage of income and assets. My parents are constantly telling me that because they wouldn't give. Okay, yeah. So I think this is it's a fair question, but a hard one to answer. So like, I think there's one important clarification point here, like that when Yale, for instance, or when any of these universities ask you to pay X amount of money, like, and that they'll give, so, you know, imagine you submit the financial aid forms and Yale says, we think you can afford to pay $20,000 a year. That means we think someone can pay $20,000 a year for you. Like it usually is your family, you know, like perhaps it's you, I don't know. They don't split it out by like family contribution. There is then the sort of like student contribution if you're on significant amounts of financial aid, which Andy covered. It's quite difficult for us to, I think, assess your specific family contribution without jumping into an enormous exercise of analyzing sort of like your financial situation, which I'm not sure is right or appropriate to do here. So yeah, like I think from my perspective, like this again, something that you can compare to the US, or for instance, like in the UK, where like often the family, like everyone has to sort of pay everything in the UK, and like some people get loans or whatever, and then they have to pay back the loan. In the US, at least your family pays to an extent what they can afford. Whether we can have a philosophical debate about whether your family should be paying for your tuition at all, perhaps in somewhere else. Any other comments on that one?
Yeah, I just sent a resource in the big chat. It's a calculator that uses US dollars to kind of see what your expected family contribution might be. I think maybe it's an average calculator, but if you're applying to schools that are need full need, so the important thing is maybe it's not, you know, need blind, but as long as they meet full need, this will be a good way to indicate whether you'll be able to get enough money.
Michaela.
Yeah, just in any case, this sort of situation is one where you ask the financial aid offices themselves. Different schools may give you different answers. The big overview though is they seem to want your family to contribute, but if your family cannot or won't contribute, that's definitely something to ask them directly.
Yeah. Okay, I think this is actually a really good question. My parents have a decent income, but it becomes quite a lot lower after taxes. And they're also divorced, and your expenses are higher than before we got divorced. And don't have many assets and services. How are your chances of financial aid? I think I will hand over to anyone who knows more. I'm almost certain the detail will be on your earnings after taxes. That would be crazy if it's not. And you know, and they also take into effect your family. They also take into account your family situation. That also includes as well, just building off of the sort of case of divorce. It also includes if you have siblings who go to university as well. And they factor that into so how much they think you can afford to pay, because you know, if you have two people going to Yale, it's twice as expensive. So yeah, please jump in, guys, if you know more than me.
I guess I can jump in. I think, like, as you already said, yeah, they definitely factor in. So I'm not sure obviously what the exact situation is, but you know, if your parents aren't living together, for example, I know through CSS, you can like opt to make somebody like a non-custodial parent, and so then your parents fill out the financial information separately, and then you have the opportunity to like state which parent is like giving you money, whether you like whether one of your parents contributes to your like education or like to your living in general. So there's like, I think there's a way on the CSS profile to make that distinction. With like, how are your chances for financial aid? I think that's a tricky question. I think the worst case scenario is that like somebody applies for aid and then the uni is like, you don't need any aid at all, which is like very unlikely. The more likely thing, and the thing that I saw with a lot of some of my other friends from the UK who were applying to US colleges through my program, was that you may get a package and you're not satisfied with how much you're getting, in which case there is most colleges have like an appeals process where you can like say why you don't think it's enough money. So I think like if you qualify for aid, like in terms of your chances of getting some aid, I think your chances of getting some aid will probably be high unless you're in like an exorbitant amount where they're like, you can pay the whole thing. The question is more about how much your aid is. And I think that really does vary college to college. But the important thing to know is that there is also like the option to appeal any package you're given if you have supporting information to show why you can't pay the amount they're telling you. So I hope that kind of gives some clarity on that.
Awesome. Okay, there's a couple more. We just did that one. Would you encourage us to still apply to the US despite the COVID situation and Trump's move on international students? Do you know personally any student who has been affected by it and how she has been coping? I do know a couple of people have been affected by it. I am looking at them. So taking the first question first, as I said, I would still encourage people to apply to the US, especially if like you think that is a sort of education that is best for you and the sort of like future you really want. And you know, we can go a bit more into that, and you can also look on our website about deciding between the US or the UK, for instance. Not that the UK government is a huge amount better, if I'm honest, but and that's sort of saying something. But I think from my perspective, like being from the UK and then studying the US and applying to the UK as well, and having lots of friends who go to the UK, like the US is just a completely next generational experience. It's offers you so many more opportunities if you can get the financial aid, like, which I think like for many of this is another important point, like in general, the people we are accepting into our project access programs are people who would likely as a heuristic be eligible for aid. You know, we accept in underprivileged students from, you know, like all around the world, as I said earlier. So I think Trump's move on international students is frankly likely to be either overturned. Like I think like 18 states appealed against it yesterday. All of the universities are appealing against it. Also, like all of the universities, or at least my university, has basically emailed me basically saying like, don't worry about it, we will figure out a way around the rule. So like, yes, certainly apply, especially if you're applying this year. You know, it's obviously impossible to predict even next week, but like hopefully by the time you go to school, you know, next fall, things will have broadly become like the sort of new normal, and like the experience will still be fantastic. In terms of how people are coping, I think it's a case of with both the COVID situation and the Trump thing. Broadly, I think people fall into like two camps. There's all the camp who are looking to go back and continue studying online, and there's also the camp that is looking for opportunities and taking a gap year. I personally took a gap year like after high school. It was very, very fulfilling, and like it's also super useful, I think, for your application, especially if you come from a place where you don't get that many resources, so you can spend a lot more time focusing on it, like myself and Ollie did. And I would really recommend that if that's something that's possible for you. So yeah, I hope that helps. I I think that's the questions. I think Andy also answered in the chat a question about Yale and test optional stuff. I think my quick comment on this, Andy is, I think Andy has pretty much captured it all. Like Yale's a need blind school. Just a quick one on like the schools that are going test optional. Yes, they're going test optional, but if you come from an area where you could have taken the test, you should try and take the test. Like they are going to view it, they're going to view the fact that you didn't negatively, basically. And anyone who has taken the test will have something basically over you. Right, I'll just stop sharing, and unless there are any other questions, I think we are sort of coming to time. Oh, there was a bunch of questions in the chat as well, which have been answered. Wow. Excellent. Well, I hope this was helpful. And yeah, as I said, like this very high level overview, reach out to us directly if you have any other questions. Apply to the sort of Project Access program. Our next sort of program class is starting on August 10th, and the applications close on August 1st. And yeah, I wish you the best, a very good day, wherever, or evening, wherever you are. Thank you.